I appreciate you stopping by today to check out this video. Hopefully you'll find something interesting and helpful. And let's go ahead and get started. So here I've opened a few browser tabs that we'll be using in a later video to install Next.js and do a quick application creation and install the few tools that are needed. And so like this Create Next.js app and the Node.js, we're going to install these tools and possibly a few others into this Windows Sandbox. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Today I'm going to be taking a look at and using the Microsoft Sandbox technology. First, I'll talk about the Sandbox from Microsoft, show how I installed it, and explain a few ways you can configure it if you don't like the default configuration. And then I'm going to use it to install and build a quick Next.js application inside of the virtual sandbox. So here on my main screen, I actually have the Microsoft Windows Sandbox running, and it's running inside of a window, so I'm dragging it around here. And if I double click in the title bar, you'll see that it maximizes itself. So now it's like full screen, which is kind of nice that it gives you that option. And if you've never heard of or used Windows Sandbox, you can go to Google, of course, and look up what is Windows Sandbox, and you'll see here Windows Sandbox provides a lightweight desktop environment to safely run applications in isolation. Software installed inside the Windows Sandbox environment remains sandboxed and runs separately from the host machine. A sandbox is temporary. When it's closed, all the software and files and the state are deleted. So I've minimized the other applications and browsers just to show the desktop of the Windows Sandbox, and you can see it says that up here, Windows Sandbox. If you want to go back to a windowed mode, you can just click this little icon up here. And if we take a quick look at what's installed on this Windows Sandbox, this is it. It has just the basic accessories. It has the Internet Explorer and or Edge browser installed. I installed the Chrome browser since I use it a lot. It has PowerShell. And it does give you a command prompt, and of course your File Explorer, your Task Manager, which I will show that briefly, and a few other basic Windows accessories and tools. So there's really not much on here. It's a very optimized and small version of the Windows 10 operating system, which makes it very fast. So what I'm going to do is set up an environment for developing some code. If you were storing it in something like GitHub, then when you were finished with your sandbox, you could just close it, open it back up, pull down your code, and work on it. There's a lot of benefits to doing something like this for safety and security, and if you do a lot of browsing and you don't want to do it on your main computer system, if you're using Microsoft Windows, it's a good, safe way to browse and do research and look up things on the internet without worrying about infecting your main machine. So there's other technology that you may or may not have heard of. One of them is called VirtualBox. It's free, and it allows you to install an entire operating system in a virtualized environment. So if you've never heard of it or used it before, you may want to go to virtualbox.org and take a look at that, but it does require that you install a full operating system that you can start up and shut down. And of course, if you're going to do that, you'll need to have enough hard drive, enough memory or RAM on your computer system, and some other settings in the BIOS. So let's take a look at how to install it first of all. So go ahead and drag this over here from the host machine, and click on Programs and then turn Windows features on or off. So then I can scroll down here and see Microsoft or just Windows Sandbox enables the dependencies required to run Windows Sandbox scenarios. So you have to click on that. Now if it's grayed out, it means your virtualization may not be turned on your computer system, and so I'll show what that looks like also. But if it is available, you can click on it, and it does require you to reboot your machine one time. So let's take a look at an example of what the BIOS may look like in your computer. I pulled up an article here for enabling virtualization technology on HP workstations and business series computers. So here it's just showing some BIOS settings where you would go down to System Security and then use your up and down arrows to select the virtualization technology, or VTX. That's right here. And in this example, it's disabled, so you have to use your BIOS and arrow keys and enable it, and then accept it and save your settings. Now there may be more than one setting underneath here. There's a second setting that I usually enable. Also, once you do that, you can save your changes and exit the BIOS, and then you have to reboot your machine. Once you do that, then the Windows Sandbox option should become available on your computer system. So let's take a look at one page here from Microsoft, the Windows Sandbox, and I'll include a link to this website in the description of the video. So if we look here, this article was either written or updated on 5/25/2023, and they go on to explain that it's a lightweight desktop environment to safely run applications in isolation. One interesting thing here is it says here, note, however, that as of Windows 11 version 22H2, your data will persist through a restart initiated from inside the virtualized environment. Useful for installing applications that require the OS to reboot. So in another video, I will be trying that out and seeing how it works, and if it works as I'm imagining it will. But for now, we're on Windows 10, so we can't try that. But again, the idea is to set up an environment to develop code, work on the code, then you would check it into GitHub as an example, so it's stored in the cloud, and then when you need to work on it again, you could just start up your virtualized sandbox, do your work, save it to the cloud, and then close it down, so you don't have to change the configuration of your main machine. I know some people like to keep their main computer systems clean and organized and not have as many files and pieces of software installed, so this gives you a good way to do that. So let's see what else here. Windows Sandbox has the following properties. It's part of Windows. Everything required for this feature is included in Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise. There's no need to download a VHD. Every time Windows Sandbox runs, it's clean as a brand new installation of Windows. And it actually is really fast to start it up. When I started up this Sandbox, I mean, it just took a couple seconds, and this computer is not one of the latest computer systems, so if you have a more modern computer system, I imagine it just starts in like 2 seconds. And it's pretty interesting how it works. So then when you close it, everything is discarded when you close the application. It's secure. It uses hardware-based virtualization. For kernel isolation, it relies on the Microsoft hypervisor to run a separate kernel that isolates Windows Sandbox from the host. It's efficient. It uses the integrated kernel schedule, smart memory management, and a virtual GPU. And I do have the network enabled because, as you can see, I'm browsing on the internet here inside of the Windows Sandbox. And they just go on to show the Windows Edition and licensing requirements, prerequisites, ARM64 or AMD64 architecture. That's for Windows 11, 22H2 or later. Virtualization capabilities enabled in the BIOS, which I showed one way of what that looks like. You need at least 4 gig of RAM, 8 gig recommended. There's 32 gig on this machine, and by default Windows Sandbox uses 4 gigabytes. At least 1 gig of free space. SSD is recommended. And I always use SSDs on computers. They're much faster, or NVMe drives, which are even faster than that. And at least 2 CPU cores. So if we take a look at the task manager inside here, you can see that it's showing that it has access to all of these CPUs or virtual processors instead of just one. And you can see by default here it has 4 gigs of memory, so that's a good amount of memory, but you may need to do more depending on what your use case will be. And it does say here Windows Sandbox is currently not supported on Windows Home Edition. So they go on to explain a little bit more about the installation process, which I've mentioned some of those things. It looks like they do have a PowerShell command that you may need to run, and turn Windows features on or off, which I showed that. Select your Windows Sandbox, click OK. And they also mention, as I did, if it's not available to be selected, it's because you don't currently have your computer configured or it can't meet the criteria. Okay, so I've opened up the downloads folder inside of the Windows Sandbox. Let's go ahead and maximize the screen again there. And now on my local computer system, I'm going to right click on an executable file and click copy. And then I'm going to come into here and click on paste. So then it's going to go ahead and paste a file, an executable file from my local machine into this Sandbox environment. So let's let that finish. And then let's go ahead and double click and we'll run it. This is the Postman tool, which is used for developing web API applications and for doing like HTTP post requests. So we'll go ahead and let it get installed, and I'll pause the video for a moment. So here it's basically up and running. It didn't take long at all, and you can go ahead and use it to perform API requests or HTTP requests. So that's just a quick overview of how you can take executable files, bring them into the virtual Windows Sandbox, and install them and run them. Again, if you're not sure about some software and you don't want to install it on your main machine, this is a great way to try things out, make sure they work the way that you want them to, and if you're okay with it, then you could go and install it on your main machine. I think it's just another great feature of the Windows Sandbox environment. When you finish experimenting, you can just close the Sandbox. A dialog box will state that all Sandbox content will be discarded and permanently deleted. Select OK. So that's basically the overview of how to get it installed, and then I'll briefly just show this sandbox configuration. They give several examples here, and one of the, I think, important things to change is how much memory that it's going to use. Currently, by default, it is using 4 gigabytes, so you may need to use more. But there's all these other settings also that you can change depending on what your needs are. So they give some examples. They tell you here the different options and values that you can add into your configuration file. And then they give some actual examples that you could use. And lastly, the Windows Sandbox architecture. I think this is interesting if you're curious more about what's actually going on behind the scenes. Here they're mentioning dynamically generated image rather than requiring a separate copy of Windows to boot the sandbox. Dynamic base image technology uses the copy of Windows already installed on the host. Most OS files are immutable and can be freely shared with the Windows Sandbox. A small subset of operating system files are mutable and can't be shared, so the sandbox base image contains pristine copies of them. A complete Windows image can be constructed from a combination of the shareable immutable files on the host and the pristine copies of the mutable files. With the help of this scheme, Windows Sandbox has a full Windows installation to boot without needing to download or store an extra copy of Windows. And that's part of the reason why it's so fast when you start up the Windows Sandbox. So they go on to explain in a lot more detail some of the things happening behind the scenes, how the memory is managed, how memory is shared, the integrated kernel scheduler, GPU virtualization. So I think it's really interesting how this technology works, and I really like using it for different scenarios depending on, again, use case. And in the second part of this video, I'm going to use this Windows Sandbox to install and configure some tools so that we can create a Next.js application. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when I post new content.